In this lecture, we're going to be considering the development of Buddhism in China and Japan. When we talked about Mahayana Buddhism, the form of Buddhism that's most common in East Asia, we mentioned the fact that the Mahayana Buddhists have a belief that there are other Buddhas besides Siddhartha Gautama. And this is very evident in Chinese Buddhism. There's really a colorful population of various Buddhas that are worshipped or focused on as objects of devotion, as well as various bodhisattvas. For example, there is Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of the future, who becomes a focus in some of the art. Amitabha Buddha is a Buddha associated with the Pure Land. And there's a whole fairly popular sect of Buddhism that focuses on the Pure Land as a kind of paradise that one goes after one dies, if one devotes oneself to Amitabha Buddha. A particularly interesting bodhisattva is Kuan Yin. I think particularly interesting not only because Kuan Yin is often depicted in art, but Kuan Yin, a female bodhisattva, was originally a male bodhisattva in India, a historical person called Avalokiteshvara. And gradually, although initially coming into China, the memory of this bodhisattva as a man was prominent, and you do occasionally see artworks that depict Kuan Yin as a man, Kuan Yin took on a lot of feminine traits in Chinese thought. So Kuan Yin in Chinese art and Kannon in Japanese art is actually the progress of this particular bodhisattva across East Asia. Kuan Yin is particularly focused on because Kuan Yin is considered to be the bodhisattva of compassion. In fact, shrines devoted to Kuan Yin sometimes point out that Kuan Yin is so compassionate, you don't have to be a Buddhist to have your prayers heard by Kuan Yin. Some of the things more philosophical about changes in Buddhism as it entered China was that there was a lot less emphasis on reincarnation. As I mentioned in the last lecture, the Chinese were initially a bit put off by the doctrine of reincarnation, particularly because of the long-term tradition of offering sacrifices to the ancestors. So reincarnation really stops being emphasized very much. Another Mahayana theme, however, becomes very prominent. That samsara, this world in which everything is linked together by means of cause and effect, is none other than nirvana. In other words, everything in the here and now is enlightened. We only need to realize it. Three philosophical schools in Chinese Buddhism that developed all placed a lot of emphasis on this doctrine. These were Huayan, Tiantai, and Chan Buddhism. Now, in fact, only one of these survives as a living practice now. There was a devastating persecution of Buddhists in 845 in China, and that more or less destroyed the basic groundwork of Huayan and Tiantai Buddhism. But each of these schools, just to emphasize what they have in common, focused a lot on the idea of the Buddha mind, the absolute mind, or the Buddha nature that is inherent in everything. We might think back to the lecture on Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna's idea that this fundamental substratum that holds everything, that supports everything that appears to us, is vibrant, even though he uses the negative word void. Again, there's the notion that's focused on that within everything that appears to us, the fundamental reality is this vibrant, fundamental Buddha nature. And that gives everything that appears before us, and every being that appears before us, tremendous value. The value doesn't focus so much on each thing separate from anything else. That's the wrong way to look at it, according to the Buddhists. But instead, any given point within the chain of cause and effect is a point that can be recognized as perfectly enlightened. So the challenge is, how do we recognize this? Chan Buddhism emphasized practice over sutras, and this may be one of the reasons that it survived. Nevertheless, regardless of whether that's the case, what it focuses on is, first of all, work and service. I mentioned in a previous lecture that Mahayana Buddhism focused a lot on the Buddha's compassionate example. So action of a sort, work, behaving in a compassionate manner tend to be the focus of emphasis in Mahayana Buddhism and Chan Buddhism in particular. So performing services is a very suitable way of expressing one's Buddhist belief. The goal of Chan Buddhism is to realize one's true nature within the everyday world. So again, the idea is the Buddha nature is here right now. The real challenge is just to realize it. Words and preconceptions, however, tend to block this. And perhaps the impact of talking about Buddhism at first in terms of Taoist terms can be felt here to a certain extent. That Buddhism too tends, particularly Chan Buddhism, tends to focus on how our words and language and expectations tends to block our ability to really understand our true nature. In this interpretation, the Buddhist interpretation, our true nature being oneness with the whole Buddha nature. So what Chan Buddhism attempts to do is put us in touch with this pre-reflective self, our true nature. And different subgroups of Chan Buddhism had different notions of how this came about. The main division was between what's called the Northern School and the Southern School. And the issue was, how does enlightenment come about? Is it something that requires years of discipline, or is it something that can come about at any time or any place? The Northern School's answer tended to be that enlightenment was gradual, that a whole process needed to be undergone most of the time for enlightenment to happen. The Southern School was more concerned with the kind of technique that might lead one to suddenly realize the Buddha nature. So anything could be a provocation for having this full experience of enlightenment. Chan Buddhism spread to Japan, and it's known there as Zen. The word Zen comes from the word zazen, which means seated meditation. And one of the most prominent proponents of zazen and Zen generally was Dogen. Dogen was the founder of the Soto school, and it tended to agree with the Northern School of Chan that a process was involved in leading to enlightenment. The process that he encouraged was the practice of seated meditation, which emphasized sitting with your eyes open in a relaxed frame of mind in an effort not to allow preconceptions to float through your mind, but instead to get in touch with one's true nature. And this is the practice of sitting meditation. That's something that's emphasized still today. Despite the fact that there is an emphasis in the Soto school on gradual enlightenment, though, what Dogen focused a lot on was the importance of being present in the moment. Indeed, this is the way, as he would see it, that you do become free of all the sorts of categories that have been part of your language, part of the opinions that people have given you throughout your life. To break free from that is to really be here now. As Dogen puts it, in reality, it is only today, or even this moment, that we can think of worldly affairs or the Buddha way. In such an unpredictable world, it is extremely foolish to waste time worrying about various ways of earning a living in order to postpone one's death, uncertain as it is, to say nothing of plotting evil against others. Put your whole mind into the practice of the way. Remember that you are alive only today in this moment. Now that's a profoundly Buddhist way of looking at things. If you keep in mind the Buddhist idea that we're all just configurations of processes and that we're subtly changing from moment to moment, that we're not completely the same being in this moment as we were in the previous moment, then our reality is really very much the moment we're in right now. And if you think about the sorts of things that become worries, some of the things that Dogen mentions, worrying about making a living, what job you have, pressures on the job, or worrying about how you're going to react to people, especially people you perceive as enemies, all of these things are just distractions and clutter. What really matters is your focus, your ability to experience what's here right now. So seated meditation is designed to be a technique that helps to bring about this awareness of just the present. The other major school of Zen Buddhism is the Rinzai sect. And this sect, unlike the Soto school, emphasized sudden enlightenment. And so it developed its own set of techniques, techniques that are designed to help stimulate sudden enlightenment. One of these is koans, the technique of a Zen master presenting a puzzling statement to a disciple. And these puzzling statements really don't make sense by rational standards. A very well-known koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, you sort of think of the sound of clapping. Do you divide it by two because there are two hands? I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. Yet it might direct your attention to the interconnection of things. There has to be an interconnection of hands for there to be clapping at all. That might be a way of rationalizing it. But that wouldn't be what the Zen master would want either. It would be suddenly a kind of flash of awareness that allowed you to see everything linked together. So that's the purpose of the koans. Some of the techniques are a little bit more violent. Zen masters sometimes hit disciples for no reason or no apparent reason. There are even tales of masters getting into fights with their students. And again, the idea is to startle the students enough that suddenly their preconceptions are dropped and they get in touch with this true nature, which is the Buddha nature. Many things about Japan made Zen Buddhism a particularly attractive option. Zen felt at home fairly soon, in part because of the background of Shinto, the traditional Japanese religion. Because Zen does place a lot of focus on absolutely anything being part of the Buddha nature, and therefore a potential moment of inspiration or enlightenment. There's a kind of background in Japan because Shinto did focus on natural objects. Natural objects were venerated, rocks, particular places, these sorts of things, mountains, these sorts of things were felt to be divine and worshipped. Well, with a background culturally of paying a lot of attention to things within the natural world, it was maybe not so difficult a move to start seeing things in the natural world as leading to enlightenment. But it wasn't only really remarkable things in the natural world that the Japanese tended to pay attention to. Even little details, small things, puppies, a blossom. These sorts of things were also very important in the sensibility that was cultivated in Japan. The high point of focusing on everyday life as abounding in aesthetic satisfaction was the Heian period, which extended from 794 to 1185. And this Heian period, the period of the Heian dynasty, was a period when Buddhism had already entered Japan, but it was also a period when attention to the everyday was cultivated in a particularly refined way. I'm going to read a couple of passages from a famous work of Japanese literature, Sai Shonagon's Pillow Book. Sai Shonagon was a lady-in-waiting to an empress during this dynasty. And her Pillow Book, which is a kind of diary, gives accounts of a lot of different experiences that she has and her responses to it, which really bring out the idea of wonderful, charming things that are experienced in everyday life as being really what life is composed of and quite magic. For example, she writes, "Letters are commonplace enough, yet what splendid things they are. When someone is in a distant province and one is worried about him, then a letter suddenly arrives, one feels as though one were seeing him face to face. Again, it is a great comfort to have expressed one's feelings in a letter, even though one knows it cannot yet have arrived. If letters did not exist, what dark depressions would come over one? When one has been worrying about something and wants to tell a certain person about it, what a relief it is to put it all down in a letter. Still greater is one's joy when a reply arrives. At that moment, a letter really seems like an elixir of life." Now, it's not that she's claiming absolutely every letter really is an elixir of life, but it's one example of the many things of the everyday world that are marvelous. Similarly, in an interpersonal interaction. This is an interaction between Sai Shonagon and the empress she served. "It was a clear moonlit night a little after the 10th of the 8th month. Her Majesty, who was residing in the empress's office, sat by the edge of the veranda while Yukon no Naishi played the flute for her. The other ladies in attendance sat together, talking and laughing. But I stayed by myself, leaning against one of the pillars of the main hall, between the main hall and the veranda. "Why so silent?" said Her Majesty. "Say something. It is sad when you do not speak." "I am gazing into the autumn moon," I replied. "Ah, yes," she remarked. "That is just what you should have said." It's a kind of magic moment of human interaction. In some ways simple, not something that requires real unusual circumstances to bring about. And yet it's these sorts of wonderful everyday experiences that give life its real value. That kind of sensibility certainly suited the idea of Zen, where the idea that anything at any moment might be a moment that leads to enlightenment is something that is supposed. Japanese aesthetic sensibility also, I think, encourages or helps to support Zen ideas, because Japanese art in general and aesthetic treatment of things aims at suggestion more than depiction. So, for example, you might see a sketch of something, or you might see a very limited palette in anything that is presented visually. The idea of not really spelling everything out, but leaving much to the viewer's imagination, is a very prominent feature of Japanese art. And this, I think, corresponds very nicely to the suggestion in Buddhism that form is something that's momentary. You almost get the impression of this being but a moment in a process when you just see a kind of sketch of something, perhaps something in motion, where your own imagination has to fill it out. Again, the idea in Buddhism is that each particular moment is just a kind of snapshot of many processes going on. So the idea of impermanence is something that is fundamental to Buddhist ideas, but also, I think, suggested in many ways by Japanese art. In fact, many Japanese arts themselves take inspiration from Zen. One of the kinds of arts that takes inspiration from Zen are arts that are performance-oriented. By this I mean that these are arts where you take on a certain role and you carry it out, such as theater. But also, the whole art of archery, for example, becomes an art, well, is an art in Japan, and is steeped in certain attitudes that come from Zen. Eugen Herrigel, a German man, went to Japan and studied with a Zen master, particularly within this art of archery. And he found his discoveries about life in general to abound from this experience. I'm going to read a passage talking about what he discovered one day when he met with the master. He complains to the master in this case about what seems to be the problem every time he tries to shoot the bow, or shoot the arrow. "When I have drawn the bow, the moment comes when I feel, unless the shot comes at once, I shall not be able to endure the tension. And what happens then? Merely that I get out of breath. So I must lose the shot whether I want to or not, because I can't wait for it any longer." "You have only described too well," replied the master, "where the difficulty lies. Do you know why you cannot wait for the shot and why you get out of breath before it has come? The right shot at the right moment does not come because you do not let go of yourself. You do not wait for fulfillment, but brace yourself for failure. So long as that is so, you have no choice but to call forth something yourself that ought to happen independently of you. And so long as you call it forth, your hand will not open in the right way, like the hand of a child. Your hand does not burst open like the skin of a ripe fruit." What the master is pointing to there are a number of ways in which what the Zen view of things would see as obstructions to insight come about. You pay too much attention to yourself. Attempting to meditate and thinking, gee, I wonder if this is the right way to meditate, is probably almost inevitable the first time someone attempts to meditate, but it's a real problem. It's a distraction. And the distractions aren't things that are distant. They're things that are happening to you immediately, wherever you happen to be. So in this case, Herrigel is trying to shoot, but he starts thinking about it. Am I really aiming right? This is just driving me crazy. I've got to go now. I've really got to do it. Sometimes I feel that way when I'm having a picture taken. I can smile for a little while and then it gets increasingly frozen. I just wish they would finally take the picture. Well, this is the kind of attitude Herrigel had toward his own performance. And what the master is saying is that once you do that, then you've really braced yourself for failure. You've sort of moved your whole body and mind into a state where failure is inevitable. That's what you're actually bringing about yourself. What's essential is to lose touch with yourself and to reach this state of pre-reflective awareness. It seems like a kind of mindlessness or a lack of anything in mind. And this emptiness is exactly what the Zen arts try to cultivate. Not having a preconception, not having your goals too much in front of you, but instead having this kind of general awareness that can move at any moment. A Zen art of swordsmanship also developed, and this was one of many reasons why the samurai particularly found Zen appealing. The samurai took over the government for a long period of time after the Heian dynasty, and the shogunate continued to rule, for a considerable period. But what the shogunate found was that Zen was very understandable, by comparison to some schools of Buddhism that focused a lot on sutras or texts. Zen was something that made a lot of sense to them. In particular, the kind of Zen notions of being immediately in the moment struck them as completely appropriate to their way of life. If you're thinking about making war, it's very important not to be constantly fretting about what's going to happen. Someone who is a good warrior is someone who is only concerned with the moment. If you pay too much attention to whether or not you're going to live or die, that may well work against you, but it's also something that's completely out of place. So for the shogunate, the idea of being concentrated in the moment, performing your action with complete focus, was something that they thought was very much in keeping with the Zen idea. Many arts that are perhaps not so pragmatically oriented too developed that have this idea of spontaneous action and not having preconceptions in mind. And one of these is ikebana, the art of arranging cut flowers. If you've seen ikebana presentations, you may have noticed that there doesn't seem to be a design that is necessarily worked out in advance. And that's because the intention is to spontaneously work with the flowers exactly as they are. The arrangement does involve a lot of art, and there are certain aspirations in it. For example, it's considered important in the arrangement to somewhere have negative space, or space where something isn't. And part of that idea is to suggest that there is a kind of nothingness at the heart of all things. Similarly, it's very important in ikebana to pay attention to the season. Indeed, this is a very important principle in many Japanese arts. And this gives one the sense of time with regard to the current situation, what flowers are blooming, and so on. But at the same time, there should be in an ikebana presentation some reference to past and future. And the idea is that the whole presentation gives you a sense of eternity precisely because you see time summed up in the moment. This is a reflection of the Zen idea that at each individual moment, everything is already present, that our existence is really connected to everything else so fundamentally that we can't separate the two. And again, we have this sense in ikebana that this is something that is presenting the whole of time at once. A philosopher who studied in Europe for a time, but is a Japanese thinker, a member of the Kyoto school, called Nishitani Kaiji, considered ikebana a very good illustration of the idea of the Buddha nature and the emptiness on which all things float. His idea is that if we look at a flower cut out of the flow of time, what we are drawn to is its expression really of the whole. I'll read a passage from Nishitani. The flowers exist with solemnity, floating in emptiness, just as though they have emerged from nothingness. The space about them, the space of the entire room, is drawn taut by the existence of the flowers, just as if it had received a charge of electricity, and the air takes on a tension and gravity. The flowers, through the certainty with which they occupy the space, sweep clear the atmosphere. The flowers themselves, however, have no awareness or intention of doing this. The sweeping clear of the air about them is the response of the space of nothingness. It is for this reason that arranged flowers, by their fundamental nature, require a setting. The flowers are simply there in their correctness, while sending forth a faint coolness from within a fathomless composure, like a person who has eradicated all attachments to life and abandoned all the expectations fundamental to our mundane existence. Through a complete silence, they communicate that which is eternal. Nishitani sees the flowers as being very much like the state of someone who has eliminated the kind of attachments that the Buddha would consider to be selfish craving. The flowers, in fact, have become detached. It's rather interesting that the word ikebana actually means making flowers live, since you might think, well, cutting flowers is clearly not the way to make flowers live. The cutting here is understood as something that brings into focus, and it brings into focus the fragility of the flower, but also its immediate presence. A flower at a certain stage of bloom simply is what it is, and we respond to it as something cut out of the flow of things, but in a way, just because it is cut out, it reminds us of how intimately it and everything are connected to this fundamental substratum that connects absolutely everything. So the arrangement in Ikebana is something that draws our attention to exactly what the Buddhists see as the fundamental insight. It draws our attention to the fact that we all float in nothingness. I mean, in a sense, the fact that the flower is cut out of from a branch or whatever kind of plant it is, we see it as floating in nothingness. The fact that it is supported really by nothing, but nevertheless is this marvelous manifestation, suggests this very idea that Zen Buddhism in particular focuses on, that absolutely any particular thing can give us the impression of this whole at once. So it's something that we focused on or cut out of experience. It's because we're aware of it that it can be a provocation of enlightenment. But what is it drawing attention to? It's drawing attention to the whole idea of a support that connects us with it. So in a way, what Ikebana reveals is the truth of flowers, the truth of everything, the truth of ourselves. Nishitani thinks that this whole conception of nothingness, awareness of the way in which we're all mutually supported by nothingness, which is, again, a translation of something that more positively understood is the vibrant void or the Buddha nature. We're all supported by this. And he thinks that getting attuned to this, becoming more aware of this, is really crucial for us to overcome some of the problems that we're facing in the modern world today. He sees our contemporary world to abound in problems of values. People have a real sense that the values that have traditionally been important to us really aren't working. Nishitani thinks attunement to this sense of the fundamental metaphysical substrate, the Buddha nature, can help people resolve these problems. I'll say more about that in the next lecture.